we're constantly trying to apply the sort of rules of Westminster and politics as usual to reform. As far as reform are concerned, they are not going to play by those electoral rules.
This will be a people versus the establishment by-election.
Welcome to The State of It, the political podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Stephen Swinford, the political editor of The Times.
I'm Lara Spirit, the deputy political editor of The Sunday Times.
And I'm Patrick Maguire, chief political commentator for The Times.
And look, we are coming to you minutes after Nigel Farage has announced that he is standing down as the Reform UK MP for Clacton, triggering a by-election. And this is something of a gamble from Farage. What he is trying to do here is move the narrative away from questions about his funding, the huge amounts of money he's received from crypto donors, and onto a kind of core by-election campaign where he's planning to flood the constituency. So I guess the question is, will it pay off? Let's start with Patrick. You'll start off for 10. Do you think this move is pretty bold? Do you think it will pay off?
Look, if you're asking, Steve, will Nigel Farage win a parliamentary by-election in Clacton? I think the answer is fairly obviously yes. You know, demographically, electorally, this is as safe reform territory as you can get. We're about to find out whether the recent headlines about Nigel Farage have dented his popularity at all in his part of the world. But I think, look, the result of this one, regardless of who contests it, is going to be very, very predictable. Nigel Farage will be returned to Parliament almost certainly on a wave of what he would say was the disdain of everyday people for the political establishment. It's whether the cost of his having done so is worth it for him nationally. I mean, listening to him earlier, we got a very angry Nigel Farage, a defiant Nigel Farage, who is, and this was something below the radar reform were trying to do, by the way, in Makerfield, showing no deference at all to what Westminster says he should or shouldn't be doing. The other thing to consider, by the way, I said regardless of who contests it, that is a live question and potentially a very meaningful one. You know, speaking to senior Labour people just before we convened for this podcast, the question they're considering, a bit like when David Davis resigned his own seat, quite idiosyncratically in 2008 in Halton Price. You know, the main parties all said, well, this is a vanity stunt. We're going to boycott it. That's the preference of some of the very senior Labour figures I've been speaking to. Steve, you revealed just a few minutes ago that Andy Burnham's team see this as a gimmick. So the Tories don't contest this. If Labour don't contest it, the Lib Dems, etc., what does this by-election look like? And are there questions over whether Farage's mandate means as much as he says it does? I mean, frankly, I think reform will see this as one, an opportunity to cock a snook at the political establishment, as they would call it, and two, actually probably road test a lot of the things they want to road test ahead of a big snap election for Nigel Farage. So I think today, more than anything, is a reminder that, you know, we're constantly trying to apply the sort of rules of Westminster and politics as usual to reform, but those are rules in a number of respects, particularly the rules of how you fight elections and how you respond to difficulty, as Nigel Farage has encountered recently. As far as reform are concerned, they are not going to play by those electoral rules. And I think we'll see that regardless of what this by-election ballot paper looks like.
And look, Lara, you've been talking to Reform in the immediate aftermath of the speech, and to call them bullish is to underestimate it, really, isn't it? They are pretty pumped up about it.
They are supremely confident about this by-election, I think it's fair to say. They say that, you know, this came to Nigel over the weekend, that he was thinking about what to do. He was chewing it over with Lee Anderson, of course, the party chair. Some of those senior reform individuals not finding out until moments before he gave that big speech to the nation at 2 p.m. this afternoon. But they would say, look, all these councillors were returned by huge margins in the recent local elections. You would expect them to be pretty bullish about this. But as Patrick says, to their mind, this is very much an opportunity by them to avoid what they genuinely seem to think is a trial by media in recent weeks, with an opportunity to say, this is what the people of Clacton have said, and definitively as and when they vote Nigel in, we'll be able to put this all behind us. I think there's obviously an interesting question about whether that's true, whether or not this does allow Nigel Farage, even if he does win with a big margin, to be able to say, okay, I've closed the door on all of these questions. But, you know, they do say genuinely that he seemed really, really angry. And this was something that it took quite a lot of deciding to make. Spoke with a small circle of close aides this morning. And it was only really this morning that he finally decided that this was the course of action that they needed to take.
I think one of the things you touched on there is, like, obviously both of you bang on. He's going to win this. There's no question about that. It does allow him to try to frame the narrative and change it, but it basically defers the problem, because the parliamentary rules stipulate that this effectively pauses the investigation, and until such a point as he is re-elected, when it resumes again. And when it resumes again, it can continue, and the full force of those sanctions can apply. So what that means is two things. It means that there are two big sets of questions he's got. One, he had a £5 million donation from Christopher Harborne, a crypto billionaire, which he's described as the equivalent of a lottery win. Like, he was lucky to get it. He says that's to pay for security. His critics say you should have declared that, because it is obviously a registrable benefit of more than £300. He says, no, it was a friend that gave this in its personal capacity. So that will be tested and still be tested. And two, as your colleague Gabriel Pogren disclosed in the Sunday Times at the weekend, lots of questions about benefits in kind provided by a guy who goes by the name of Posh George, George Cottrell, who gave him security, who gave him covered kind of transport costs and also accommodation, which arguably should have been declared. Farage again denies categorically these shows and says there is no wrongdoing there. That's just paused. So there is this quite amazing world in which we could get a by-election that Farage wins comprehensively, probably largely because it's contested only by him. And then we suddenly move into the world where he gets sanctioned, it triggers a suspension from the Commons, and ultimately results in another by-election. And I cannot remember the last time there were two by-elections in a year. Patrick, this is one for you. John Wilkes. John Wilkes, 1767. No.
Steve, you have missed the 1990 by-elections in Bootle, where two Labour MPs died within about 8 weeks of each other. There was a by-election after a Labour MP died. Another Labour MP took his place, then died very quickly. That by-election, by the way, notable because the second by-election...
But Farage isn't dying here. This is two different individuals. I don't think it's a valid comparison.
True. I'm so sorry. I jumped the gun. I don't know. In which case it was
So you
John
go to, it's a guy called John Wilkes, who's a radical journalist in like 1760 something, who had 3 by-elections where he was returned by the people and Parliament barred him, and eventually had a vote to just permanently bar him. It caused a massive scandal. He ran on an anti-government, look, different times, right? Anyway, I'm not saying that Farage is channeling John Wilkes, but either way, it's quite an unprecedented set of circumstances. The broad point I was trying to make is that Farage's contention is this is me against the establishment. It doesn't mean the questions about the funding go away, and it doesn't mean that the investigation goes away.
It doesn't, but it is an attempt to override those questions with the power of a mandate from the people. Now, obviously, Boris Johnson ended up in a similar position in the end, right? Whereas he had this massive mandate in 2019 and ended up done over by the Privileges Committee and then ended up quitting. Now, Boris Johnson didn't come back and fight. It's also worth saying that, we're talking about the possibility of the Standards Commissioner and the Standards Committee saying to Nigel Farage in the end, listen, you've broken the rules. We think you've broken the rules. We're going to suspend you from the House for, 30 days, 6 months, something like that. When I was speaking to ministers about this possibility, quite senior ministers about this possibility, maybe, a month or so ago, when around the time when the investigation was first announced, I said, okay, say there's a recall petition in Clacton, because it's not an automatic thing. 10% of the electorate in Clacton would have to sign. And usually what happens there, it's happened in several by-elections in the last Parliament, what Labour do or what other parties do is they do a big operation where they get people to sign the recall petition just as they would canvass people. And I was saying to ministers, well, in Clacton, would you do that? And they said, are you crazy? What would be the point? Why would we get people to sign a petition to trigger a by-election when Nigel Farage would win anyway and would win as I got this sanction from the Commons, and then I went to the people, and the people didn't care because they know it's an establishment stitch up. You know, that was always the risk as Labour saw it, and it's probably still the risk the second time, particularly if he's already won a by-election, because this stuff costs money for all the parties to contest. Maybe they'll think it's money well spent. The other possibility, by the way, and I know Labour people are talking about this as well, is okay, what about if the main parties don't contest it and they find someone like Martin Bell in Tatton in 1997, the man in the white suit, someone who stands and says, well, we can all agree we don't like that guy and vote for me, I'm squeaky clean, etc., etc. I mean, I've not spoken to Reform about this, but I imagine they'd say, well, brilliant. Look, that's the Uni Party conspiring to attack Nigel Farage. So, not saying that this is, plain sailing for Nigel Farage. Clearly, he'd much rather not be resigning from Parliament in Clacton. And, there is a world in which this takes chunks out of him. He comes out the other end as a slightly diminished figure. He's no longer the sort of 30%, 40% politician Reform hoped he would be this time last year. He ends up as a sort of 25, 30% politician. There's lots of risks, upside risks and downside risks for everybody here. But it is a bit like what Zhou Enlai said about the French Revolution famously. The consequences are, it's too soon to tell the consequences of any of this. What we do know in the meantime is that Nigel Farage has totally commandeered the news agenda today, right? He says he's going to do a personal statement. All of Westminster stops, lays down its tools, waits to watch. Everybody's broadcasting it on telly. We're hanging on his every word. The first 6 weeks or so of Andy Burnham's, be interesting this, right? The first 6 weeks or so of Andy Burnham's premiership are now going to have the spectre of Nigel Farage hanging over them in a way they wouldn't necessarily have done before. And, if Andy Burnham doesn't run a candidate in Clacton, will Nigel Farage say he's running scared? If there is an attempt to run a sort of single issue Nigel anti-Farage, anti-corruption, anti-whatever challenges Nigel Farage, can Nigel Farage say to voters in Burnham country, well, hang on, look at this guy. He's joining forces with the Tories. This isn't change. This is why you need us to shake it up. I think the long and short of it is Nigel Farage has seized control of the agenda again today in a way that basically only he is capable of doing.
One of the things tying into that we were talking about earlier is the fact that Andy Burnham takes a very different approach to Nigel Farage to Keir Starmer. So at the moment, you've got an entire Labour Party machine which is geared around going for Farage. So go for him at all costs. They reported to the Electoral Commission today. They pursue him and prosecute him with vigour. And Starmer does that personally. It's the Morgan McSweeney strategy. And to be frank, it hasn't worked for them. They haven't seen a boost in their ratings. Whereas the Burnham strategy that we saw in Makerfield was to kind of go over that, go above that, barely mention Farage, kind of talk broadly about dark politics and stuff like that, but don't mention him by name. We were comparing it to the Rishi Sunak strategy. And there is a world in which that is what we see again. There is a big shift within Labour about how you deal with Nigel Farage.
Yeah, and I do actually think it goes to the core of what Andy Burnham is like as a politician and a person, which is that he is just a less adversarial character. That's just not what his politics are. He doesn't like doing that. He talks about his time in Manchester, about the fact that he was always gracious towards other parties. But it's not just, I think you're right, it's not just this kind of so-called progressive alliance where you can accept others who are sort of broadly similar to you with small differences in his view. It's actually also how you deal with your adversaries. And I think you're right to talk about Makerfield, because that was to them a real blueprint for how you can handle reform, which is you don't need to run a highly personalised, aggressive attack campaign.
You don't talk about them.
Against Nigel Farage. And I thought it was interesting to see that line about a gimmick, because it is something that those around Burnham are working through in real time, is just how do you deal with Nigel Farage. I think it's worth also just saying on the statement today, there have been rumours in recent weeks that Nigel Farage was unwell, that he was personally unwell. This was something that I've been speaking to Reform about, and they were quite comfortable for us to talk about this. They think that has its roots in enemies of Farage who basically are just hopeful that he's ill because it's their only means of, in their view, beating him. But they say they are categorically untrue. He is in fine health. And it is basically sick, in their words, to describe Farage as unwell. I think it's interesting. And then you say, one of the reasons why they say one of the reasons why people might think this is because it is true to say he's looked like he's enjoying politics less of late, because he's really, really angry is what their case was. And Steve, you and I spoke about this earlier, that visibly in recent days, he's been seen to genuinely be having an awful time, which is quite unique for him. This is a politician who really has built quite a lot of political capital on being somebody who enjoys politics in a way that makes him quite unique.
The other thing that it's worth saying, you spoke about Nigel Farage's enemies there, Lara. I think that's a crucial point. And when we imagine Nigel Farage's enemies, you think about, his critics on the left. A striking feature of the last week or so, the last fortnight or so, is there have been rumblings from inside Reform. And when I say inside Reform, I mean the big political party. I don't mean the Reform leadership, which, as you described earlier, Lara, is actually pretty close-knit. It's maximum. The people who matter in Reform, as in really matter, don't really number more than 5 in terms of the people who actually take the big strategic decisions. But in this sort of extended universe, the ensemble cast of people who think they are big cheeses in Reform, there are parts of that bigger group, it's probably about 50 people, who, are sounding off about Nigel Farage behind the scenes. There have been briefings to newspapers. David Bull, the former party chairman, even said the other day, Nigel needs to take a break. And by the standards of Reform in recent times, even implicit criticism of Nigel Farage has been very, very unusual. And there's been this sort of soundtrack, this sort of ambient soundtrack over the past fortnight or so, suggesting that all is not well among that sort of broader cast of people. What Nigel Farage has done today has basically reminded his critics inside Reform, and they do exist, and they were feeling sort of slightly emboldened. This is my party. It is my way or the highway. You're not going to sack me. You have to back me. And so, it's not just an external facing thing. It sort of consolidates his power over Reform at a time when, for the first time, sort of the also-rans and bit part players were beginning to think, well, maybe Nigel is the problem, etc., etc. A big thumping mandate in Clacton will say very firmly to some of the people in his own party, no, guys, this is the Nigel show. And even when you think I am on the run, this is what I can do. It is a gamble. It's a calculated gamble. Who knows, it might backfire. But you can well understand why that small circle of people Lara was talking about concluded, and Nigel Farage concluded, this is the only course of action.
It was becoming very debilitating for him. So he is often criticised as a one-man band. I've said that to him before. People say you're a one-man band. And he actually leans into it and talks about, well, we're getting a more presidential system. I am the president in name.
Does he say? He also says something along the lines of, when I was speaking to him, he'll say, well, if someone comes along that can do this, that would be great. Essentially,
yeah, but they don't exist. So he is a one-man band effectively, and he is a single point of success and a single point of failure. And what you've seen in recent weeks is these questions over the finances and this huge amount of money, particularly from Christopher Harborne, have just sucked all of the oxygen out of Reform. That instead of talking about the things he wants to be talking about, which is the broken state, the small boat crossings, last summer we had a whole summer where he was dominating the narrative on his terms, with weekly press conferences on his terms, and instead it's all been on the defensive. We've seen less of it in the media, and when we did do a broadcast round, when he did do one, it was very, very defensive and pretty hostile exchanges with interviewers. So this is an attempt to break that cycle, to try to frame the narrative on his terms again. And I expect when it comes to questions about his finances, his new answer is going to be, this is all just an establishment stitch up. And it's trying to just shut it down. A notably Trumpian message, which is interesting because that is exactly what Donald Trump suggested on his Truth social media, that this was the kind of Trump framing of, when you are under attack, it's because it's the mainstream media, it's, and you attack the broad structure of the establishment rather than tackling and dealing with the questions directly themselves.
Yeah, I guess these elections are, to some politicians, seen, you can reduce your problems to one, win or lose in a single election. And actually, tuning in as I did on Friday evening to the Ask Me Anything on Reddit that Andy Burnham did, there was a question from Kemi Badenoch on there about him taking soft questions, i.e. he's on a basically social media platform where he can choose what he answers. And Burnham's response was something along the lines of, well, 70,000 odd voters have given me their vote, so go away, basically.
Yeah.
So, politicians do rely on that argument quite a lot, which is essentially, once you have a recent mandate, you don't really have to do that much else bar referencing it. It does give them a sense of authority in that regard.
Yeah, totally. And the Burnham comparison is instructive. I mean, let's think back to Makerfield. There was understandably a little bit of relish in some of the commentary on Reform's campaign. Basically, haha, they picked a plumber. He spent all of the time talking about his sexist tweets, yada, 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 all of which was true. And yes, Reform probably underperformed a little bit relative to what they expected against the local elections, although worth saying they did overperform their national polling in Makerfield. But the big thing that they were trying to do in that campaign was it was pretty experimental in some ways. They were dropping massive policy announcements on socials first. They were doing lots of creative things with their video content. And I remember having a conversation with a senior Reform person about this. It became a test run for how do you fight an election where you're not totally dependent on the old ways of doing things. And we may well see Nigel Farage run a totally different by-election campaign to any of the ones we've covered before. And it gives Reform the opportunity to treat it as almost a laboratory for all the campaigning techniques. At what price? Will there be this reputational stain on Nigel Farage going forward? Who knows? But as an opportunity for a political party, purely operationally, it's a pretty big one.
Look, the other thing is they need a by-election win. So much of politics is momentum, and they've led the polls for a very long time, albeit that lead is diminished now from where it was, but they're still leading the polls. They obviously had a massive breakthrough at the local elections, and we reported today, our colleague Max Kendricks in the US revealed that Donald Trump had rang up Farage to congratulate him because he likes winners and wanted to be associated with that. But they need a by-election win because they've lost quite a few by-elections now. So obviously this is going to be a by-election win, and they will hope to carry that momentum forward once again to kind of get some positive vibes. Because I remember you saying, Patrick, in a very early podcast that we did on State of It, that the problem that Labour people then, Starmer's people, were having with Farage is it's just attacking vibes. It's like just attacking an amorphous vibe rather than a person. And the change since we did that podcast is now people are attacking him over specifics, sources of funding, etc. It's no longer just vibes. There's tangible scrutiny of a man who wants to enter number 10. And that has made him an easier target for some of his critics.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you're right, that is the difference, because they can now attack the man and his... Well, it's interesting. I was about to say his personal record, which is what Nigel Farage would say. His critics would say it's about standards of probity in public life and parliamentary rules. Look, I mean, we are about to discover, and I suspect in a fairly straightforward and not especially complicated way, the extent to which Reform's core vote care about that. And look, I think on current evidence, you'd say not very much. It may be interesting. Look, we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. The writ hasn't even been moved. Does his vote go up? Does his vote go down? I mean, those are the questions that in time we will consider. But what to watch will be, and it will give us a huge insight into how Reform are preparing for the snap election. Their entire party machinery is geared towards preparing for. Is how do they fight this? The Farage case is that the whole establishment in Westminster, every other party, the media, etc., are corrupt. It's rigged against him. He's just told the chief executive of his local council that he Reform will pay for the by-election, etc., etc. So, there will be just, I think, a long and concerted attempt to do everything differently in a way that confounds Westminster. So, it's going to be a fascinating campaign to cover in that respect, and I think it'll be impossible to ignore, even if the other parties conscientiously object to it. I mean, Kemi Badenoch is calling it a hissy fit by-election. The Labour Party, from the conversations I've been having, don't want to play. They don't want to play Farage's game. They think it's their waste of Andy Burnham's time. As we've all been saying, you can imagine a world in which Andy Burnham basically pretends this isn't happening for six weeks, and sort of, and tries to sort of, make the most of what was looking to be like a nice summer honeymoon as Prime Minister, but instead it'll be a long and noisy conversation about Nigel Farage.
Well, I think that brings this week's episode of The State of It to a close. We will be back probably quite shortly at this rate, because there seems to be quite a few emergency podcasts to do. But thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much to Molly Guinness, Harry Kitson and Ewan Daughtry.
Yeah.